Japan, the land where the sun rises. Today I would like to talk with you about some amazing fashion from the past. It's simple, it's intriguing, and it's full of charm. Of course, I'm talking about Japanese fashion history. Japan has a millenary tradition and recorded history. So where do you start? Of course, falling in love with a visionary director and his jidaigeki. I hope I said that right. His historical dramas. I obviously mean Akira Kurosawa, one of the most beloved directors of the 20th century, and one of the main reasons Japanese cinema is known worldwide. The first movie of Kurosawa's I've seen was Kagemusha, and I loved it. I still do today. Rewatching it, I've discovered all the costume details and the passion they put into it. They are a crucial piece that makes this a work of art. I also think it's a good starting point to look at Japanese fashion history. You know why? Let's see. Nowadays, when we talk about Japan, we immediately think kimono, samurai, and geisha. And it's true that mysterious Japan is tightly linked with these images. But how and when did they come alive? That is when Kagemusha comes in, because the story is set during the Sengoku period, or later Muromachi era. Japanese had a very complicated way to keep track of time. And it's a part historical, a part fictional story about a warrior lord, Takeda Shingen. The Sengoku period is right before Japan closed its borders and for a few centuries entered a sort of auto-isolation, being cut off from outside influences. In this time, Japan developed a very unique culture and a very unique aesthetic sense. This is what today we associate with traditional Japan. That means Kagemusha is set exactly in the time when everything started. It was still in its bud, but was already there. It was the time of the samurais and their way of life, the Bushido. It was when the kozode, the ancestor of kimono, was widely worn. And geishas, alas, they were not a thing yet. And what do you wish in a movie? Here we have war, drama, loyalty, and tragedy. What more do you want? But before we dive into the details what they wore in the Sengoku period and what they reconstructed in the Kagemusha movie, designed by the amazing Seiichiro Hakukazawa, of whom unfortunately I couldn't find much information. If you have some, share it please. Let's have a look at some basic aspects of Japanese fashion. The item of a traditional Japanese wardrobe is, surprise, surprise, a robe. When I say robe, I mean a piece of clothing that closes at the front, overlapping or not, and is fixed only by ties or a belt, nothing else. The national dress and vastly known robe of Japan is of course the kimono. I think it's almost disrespectful to call it just a robe, but I only want to describe what the structure of it is, which is the basic structure for any traditional dress of Japan. You need an undershirt? It will be a wide, shorter robe. You need a coat? It will be a wider, maybe with a square neck, robe. And remember, always left over right. Only the dead wear it the other way. Not all these items are called kimono, even if literally kimono means thing worn. There are specific names for each piece of clothing, depending on its purpose or even on the shape of the sleeves. The modern kimono appears in the Edo and Meiji period. Before that there was the kozode, which means tight sleeves. That was because the wrist opening was quite small, and the sleeves themselves were shorter and rounder than the modern kimono. That from a simple piece of cloth, wrapped and tied, Japanese could make so much out of it. I think it's completely amazing. But what is that makes a Japanese outfit unique? Layers, layers, layers. One way to make something more interesting, rich and compelling is of course to add more layers to it. Class, wealth and occasion were all indicated by how many layers you put on. You were rich and eccentric, you drown in layers. You worried more about your dinner than your Sunday dress, probably a layer would be enough and would say it all. As we will see later, looking at Kagemusha's costumes, with one piece of clothing you can do so much. Japanese always loved a good pattern. I think they still do. Each different pattern could also have a specific meaning. A bit in the same way that Chinese embroidery had always an explanation in this time. They could ward off evil, bring good luck, or maybe describe some virtue of the wearer. Let's see, for example, the pattern Nami, flowing waves, which indicated strength. That was why it was often used for armors and banners. Or the pattern Asanoha, which literally means hemp leaves and was used often for children's clothes, so they would also grow as fast and as healthy as the hemp plants. This love of pattern is what often makes unique a piece of clothing, and they developed such amazing techniques to create different ones. They had so many ways to dye, tie-dye for example. They also used stencil art, or they even painted directly on the fabric. Embroidery was also used to complete the look, of course. When we imagine lush kimonos, of course we can feel the soft silk on our skin. But in the past, like in the Sengoku period, silk was something exclusively used by the Han class. Hemp and linen were very easy to cultivate and could be produced at home, and that was why it was the most common. In this period though, cotton stopped being imported from the continent and started to be cultivated in Japan. It became one of the most used fabrics later on. The indigo-colored cotton is still something linked to Japanese culture. The interesting aspect about shoes is that there were none. And with that, I don't mean that they ran around barefoot all the time. Just they didn't use a proper item with a sole and a cover for the feet. Instead, they preferred sandals. Apart from the humid climate that calls for lighter footwear, sandals were a good option for a population that never wore any footwear in the house. They still don't. So sandals were easy to put on or take off when entering or leaving the house. I think that was one main reason they were so popular. The most common footwear were geta, waraji, and warazori. Geta are a sort of clog with a wooden sole and some wooden mount, called teeth, that elevated the wearer from the ground or kept in place by fabric straps. There are so many types of geta, with different shapes and number of supports, with different heights and decorated or lacquered in various ways. It was very practical for everyday use outside, as it kept your clothes far away from the dirt. This type of clog was imported from China way before the Sengoku period. But when it disappeared in its country of origin, it became the iconic footwear of Japan. Of course, if you had to run, do hard work, geta were not a good option. So what else did they wear? In this case, to choose a waraji was much more practical. Made usually of rice straw, it had a sole tied to the ankle by straps. Cheap and comfortable, it was therefore the footwear of choice of peasants and samurai. From the waraji, we pass to the warazori, also made of rice straw but without the ties to the ankle. It is in fact the ancestor of the flip-flop and was worn every day, in easygoing or even more formal occasions. Of course, these elements are what struck me as interesting about Japanese fashion. What, in my eyes, makes it unique and different from everything else. What do you think is quite unique in traditional Japanese clothes? Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please click like and subscribe, especially if you want to see my next video exploring in depth what samurais wore, looking at the wonderful costumes of the movie Kagemusha. Ciao ciao!